So what are the government and their spending up to again? Ladies and gentlemen, right now they're dealing with what's called loosening the budget rules. What does that mean? Before you fall asleep, it's actually quite interesting because the previous government of Peter Fiala left behind a certain budget here. The current government says that the budget was insufficient, that it was bad, and that it wasn't realistic, and that this government will therefore put together a realistic budget. At the same time, they say they want to invest a lot, they want to build a lot, they want to do a lot of things, dams, highways, roads, railways, Dukovany, Temelin. They want to build everything, but they also want to go massively into debt for it. And so we see here a new law which, if approved, will actually allow this government or any future government to spend 10% more from the state budget and take on 10% more debt without the approval of Parliament. Because you always have to have parliamentary approval for your budget. And the new government says they want to push through a law where they will have a certain budget, and then they will be able to increase that budget by 10% whenever they want. If that 10% includes strategic infrastructure projects, if there are expenses for things that are, let's say, compatible with solving some strategic interests of the Czech Republic or threats to the Czech Republic and so on and so forth. Simply put, it's about infrastructure and addressing some kind of threat. I read it as them wanting to present it as a law that says if some threat comes, if some unexpected situation arises, they can immediately spend money from the budget, immediately go into debt, immediately send the money there, and deal with the unexpected situation without having to discuss it with Parliament. Which makes sense to a certain extent because something can happen at any moment, and wasting time by having to borrow the money and get Parliament's approval is kind of cumbersome. So I understand this argument. At the same time, I understand the argument that they simply want to take on more debt and build more, and since they currently have a fiscal responsibility law that holds them back, it doesn't allow for such high investments as it might if they could somehow exceed it. And now they want to pass a law that will allow them to exceed the legal budget so they can go over the budget for the sake of investments. But of course, there's also a huge concern that they will use that extra 10% of spending as a manipulative tactic. Let me put it to you like this. Imagine that this government approves a budget where it suddenly says, yeah, at the end of the year, it suddenly says that the budget has a deficit out of nowhere, maybe only 50 billion or 100 billion, right? From a budget that had a 300 billion deficit, which was left by Fiala's government, the last budget, suddenly I bring it down to 100. Well, that's great. That's amazing. But after everyone sells it as if there's only 100 billion and how they're saving and how great it is, the debates about this will die down, and suddenly the year will go on, and suddenly, of course, the money will run out, and they'll find out that those 100 billion aren't enough. And so, quietly covered by this new law that allows them to increase spending by 10%, they'll go into debt by another, say, 250 billion, for example, and that way they'll make up the shortfall, the deficit. So in the charts on TV, everyone will see that they only had a deficit of 100 billion, but in reality, they'll create a deficit of maybe 300 or 350 billion thanks to that new law, which allows them to go into debt for defense spending and construction and infrastructure. So this is the thing. There's this concern that in this way they'll manipulate the budgets, where on one hand they'll show people how much they're saving, how low their deficits are, and on the other hand they'll flexibly increase it during the year just so they can function at all. That it's effectively not any real saving. that it's not something that actually helps the state, that it's just cooking the books so that some nice numbers come out of it, so it looks good in the presentation, and then somewhere in some side meeting, you'll just bump up the funds as you need so it works out, and you won't show it to anyone. Instead of writing 350 billion in the debt column, you just write 100 billion in the debt column and then 250 billion in the additional expenses column, call it something else, put it in a different column, underline it, and say, well, that's not debt, that's something else. But the problem is that just because you call it something else doesn't mean it becomes something else. It will still be the same debt, only the voters will be manipulated by the fact that it's called something different. Total manipulation, total nonsense, right? So that's actually the second concern. So the first argument is that they need to have room for a flexible response when they need to pay for something, patch something up if there's a problem, or if it turns out that something is needed. The second argument against it is that they could use this to manipulate the budget. Then, of course, there's the question of what's going on with the budget, with the money. And here it's obviously true that we need to invest. We need to build, build, build. That's an undeniable truth. That's clear. And build even if it means going into debt. But maybe the problem here is that instead of cutting back a bit on the welfare state and putting much more into infrastructure, we don't cut back on the welfare state at all and just fund the infrastructure with debt, which is borrowing too fast. And it could happen that even though we have low debt now, and let's say some interest that we're paying, it could happen that we build those roads, those railways, those electric car factories, power plants for some amount of debt, and the government will sell it to us like, look, 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 it's fine that we went into debt, we built it. Now we have highways, railways, power plants, everything. That's why the debt was created, but it's fine because it will pay off in the end. But if we go into too much debt and the interest is so high that it outweighs the benefits of those projects, then the debt will simply be disadvantageous. It's like if you took out a loan from the bank with an interest rate of 6% and the money you invested helped you build a company that's worth the value of the debt plus 3%. So if you take a loan with a 6% interest rate, and you build something that's worth the borrowed amount plus 3%, that's a disadvantageous debt, so it's simply not worth it. Because you weren't able to make the debt pay off more than the interest rate you borrowed it at. And that's something that could simply happen here. That's something that's absolutely not needed here. And so I would say that a much better approach, simply a much better approach, is to make more cuts, raise some taxes as well, and definitely not try to cover everything with debt, because that could lead to the investment not paying off in the end, and the debt ending up being more expensive than the return. That's something that really needs to be calculated. Of course, it's also good to mention that the new budget, the new way of managing money, will look like this. They'll put all the usual items like pensions, social issues, healthcare, and so on into one column. They'll write all of that there. The things that are bloated and inefficient and unnecessarily take up money because they're handled inefficiently, all of that. And for the necessary things, they'll make a special budget. And this way they'll say, well, this is for the functioning of the social system, and these are the investments. So they'll split it into two envelopes like this and say that this envelope is something different. But in reality, it should work so that everything is in one envelope. And even in that one envelope, it at least somewhat adds up. So in this regard, it's really more like cooking the books than actually doing something responsible with it. And what's maybe, again, a little bit, just to take a jab at Fiala's government, the problem on their side might be that while Babish's government wants to bury us in financial debt, really bury us in debt, but at least they want to build things, they want to do things. Fiala's government wanted to leave us with infrastructure debt. I would probably compare it like this. Fiala and his crew, Jura, approached it like Husak. That is, the numbers in the accounts will look good, the debt will be low, but then you look around and the roads will be full of potholes, the highways unfinished, the apartment blocks dirty, the air disgusting, and everything will be messed up, right? Right? Versus Babish's government, which says, well, we'll have nice apartment blocks, the roads won't have potholes, the highways will be finished, the power plants will be generating power, the dams will be doing their job, everything will be beautiful, but the budget will be messed up. Right? So we have two sides here, where one wants to save so much that they'd sacrifice building infrastructure, and the other wants to spend so much that they'd be able to ruin public finances. And it seems to me that what's missing here is some kind of middle ground where the government would invest, not try to save on things that need to be done, built, and so on, but at the same time would cut back on the welfare state, which simply does harm here and creates an entitlement society that can't do or secure anything without the state's crutch. I would say that what's really needed here is for the state to focus more on the important things like building highways, critical infrastructure, defense, and so on, and to care much less about who gets what money, who gets what benefits, who gets what discounts, basically to shrink the welfare state and use more of that spending for infrastructure. And of course, that means having some debt, but not having debt just for the sake of building and investing only from debt. Invest and build also from what you earn yourself, or from what you might generate by cutting back a bit on the welfare state and shifting some of that weight more onto the market. No. So that's how it is, you know? There's no golden middle ground here. There's no golden middle ground here. We just have people who want to stop all construction when there's no money, and on the other side, people who want to borrow billions and build everything. But you just can't do it like this. I just hope that in the end, these two economic extremes will somehow lead to a compromise so that the debt won't get completely out of H and that there will be some cuts and maybe even some tax increases or something like that. A little bit of budget responsibility. But at the same time, that budget responsibility won't come at the expense of investments. That would be worse, of course. Budget responsibility simply has to come at the expense. Well, for example, the quality and availability of free public health care, for instance, or at the expense of subsidized public transport, for example. Yeah, or at the expense of fare discounts, or at the expense of capping fucking gasoline prices. Yeah, for these socialist things that make people more comfortable, but they aren't really essential for the state to provide. So that's it. Write in the comments what you think about this, how you see it. And personally, I'm a big fan of building much more rather than just sticking to budget responsibility and not building, for example. Yeah, I don't mind going heavily into debt if it means we'll have that power plant, those dams, those highways, and those high-speed trains here. I really wouldn't mind going heavily into debt. If I knew that building these things would increase GDP and bring more growth, more value to the Czech Republic's economy, then the interest on that loan would cost. And that's something you simply have to calculate. I don't have those numbers right now. But if there's some really insanely good economic company or organization or something, or simply a ministry that managed to calculate that if you borrow $1 trillion for building roads, railways, highways, airports and everything, if you borrow $1 trillion at a specific interest rate they're offering us, it would cause such a boom and such growth that we'd earn that trillion 3 times over. At that point, sure, go ahead and borrow $1 trillion. But if there's a pretty big risk that we'll get into so much debt that the growth won't be able to compensate for it, for the interest or the increased cost of the loan, then I'd say it's much more reasonable to just tighten our belts. And that's it. So that's how it is, you know. Watch the streams, watch the videos. We're moving forward. Take care. Bye.